Sorry, okay.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. We're just letting some people enter the room. Everyone's trickling in, so we'll just give it a minute for that to happen. All right, I think we'll start now, and some other folks might join as we go. We are still missing one of our speakers, so hopefully she will be able to connect with us soon. My name is Ray Atchison, and I am the director of Reaching Critical Will, which is the disarmament program of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. Thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar that is looking at connections between the movements to abolish nuclear weapons, nuclear energy, and the fossil fuel and extractive industries, and connecting the work that all of us are doing in different spheres to build a better world, which is necessary in this time of grave strife. So this project came together from Reaching Critical Will, the disarmament program, together with WILPF's Women, Peace and Security program and environment program. So it was a team effort across many different themes within the organization. It was generously funded by Plowshares Fund. So thank you very much to them for being the donor on this project. Really, what we wanted to do was investigate connections between the nuclear and fossil fuel industries and state repression of activism against these industries. So the project that we've done, the report that we've produced, offers feminist perspectives on how the nuclear and fossil fuel industries operate and entrench their power. It looks at their impacts on communities, the harms that they cause in the world, and then also how resistance against these industries is suppressed by police or militaries or private military and security companies. And we really generated this idea from the understanding that these powerful industries are shaping many of the realities of the world that we live in today. They're influencing ecological health, human rights, and the ability of communities to live in peace and security. And at this moment of intensifying global violence with Israel's genocide of Palestinians, and now its attacks on Lebanon, and unfettered support from the United States and other major arms producing companies, the complete breakdown that we're witnessing of international law in this context, or the way that it's being applied, is very clear, I think, to most of us that are working on issues of war and weapons and climate change, that the influence of profiteering plays an absolutely fundamental role in ruining lives, in privileging certain people and states over others. And the fossil fuel industry is also directly profiting from the genocide in relation to the provision of massive amounts of jet fuel to Israel. The nuclear industry is also profiting. Many of the companies that make nuclear weapons are the same ones that are making the bombs and missiles being shipped to conflicts around the world. So we see that both the fossil fuel industry and the nuclear industry constitute an existential threat to humanity and to all species on our shared planet. But despite this, the burning of fossil fuels and the existence of nuclear weapons and nuclear energy continue to be justified and legitimized by entrenched interests in governments and industry. The nuclear and fossil fuel industries are connected through colonial pasts and imperial presence, through corporate connections and patriarchal structures, through their capturing of state politics and their use of the state's repressive forces, like the police and military, to suppress dissent and protest. The report that we produced, which is called Petrobromance Nuclear Priesthood and Police Repression, Feminist Confrontations of Violent Industries and Movements to Abolish Them, highlights and unpacks these connections. Through research and also conversations with activists, academics, and affected community members, the report dives into the fossil fuel and nuclear industries, struggles of building movements against these industries, experiences of police violence, and also hope for the future and imaginative recommendations for building a better world. And the hope of those of us who've been working on this project for the past year or so is to provide a common knowledge base from which social movements can continue their essential work against industries and institutions of state violence. In the process of conducting this research through group interviews and consultations, bringing together activists from across anti-nuclear, climate, environmental, land defense, and abolitionist movements. This really helped to create connections and spark discussions among people about the diverse ways in which we can deepen our joint strategizing and collaboration. And Joni, one of our speakers, is responsible for the term petrobromance used in the report title, which describes the patriarchal support for fossil fuels, which is similar to the systems of patriarchy and hierarchy and the tech bro culture that falsely promotes nuclear energy as a solution to climate change or nuclear weapons as a solution to insecurity. And ultimately, we see that nuclearism, fossil fuel addiction, police brutality, they're all systems of violence that protect the profits and power of a minority while seriously harming the rest of us, making the world unlivable for most people. So they all have to go, and we have the best chance of making them go if we're working together. And so with that, I want to introduce the speakers for today, including two people that we interviewed for the report. At the moment, it looks like we only have one with us, but hopefully Edwick will be able to join as we continue. So Joni Sears, a feminist environmentalist, distinguished professor of arts and sciences at Bentley University, a fossil fuel treaty campaign champion, and she's spent years researching the intersection of fossil fuels, hypermasculinity, and militarism. And Edwick, if she joins, Edwick Madzimar is a doctoral researcher who's passionate about gendered dimensions in rural livelihoods, environmental peace building, feminist political economy analysis, feminist responses to climate change, and challenging militarized political economies. So they will each speak about their contributions to this report and the hopes they have for this project moving forward. And then we're going to hear from Genevieve Riccoboni, who's the Women, Peace and Security Program Coordinator at WILPF. And she's going to speak about the recommendations that are in the report and then our next steps for this project. So Joni, I will turn it over to you now.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm so pleased to be here and really thrilled that so many people are able to attend this session. This is a really remarkable project and remarkable report because it brings together so many lenses on, the heady combination of fossil fuels, nuclear, militarism, police repression, capitalism, and the interlocking of all of those forces. But I was thinking particularly about this webinar today because I just was reading about Microsoft's plan to buy and to reinvigorate the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant. Somehow this missed me. I guess it was announced a couple of weeks ago, or maybe even longer, but it just came to my attention this week anyway. And I kind of slapped my head and I said, "This is like the perfect illustration of the combination of elite capture and the convergence of, as Ray said, kind of the tech bro culture, the attachment to nuclear power as somehow an alternative to climate change, which is just, I just want to say right out front, completely ridiculous. It's a completely ridiculous, quote, solution. It's not a solution at all. It's just a trade-off of planetary crises, swapping one out for the other and saying, oh, it's a solution. It's like it's not at all. But, thank you. Ray has put in the chat where the report is available. Very important to have that information. So Okay, so let me say a few things about frameworks for understanding this convergence of um, energy interests, fossil fuel, nuclear, elite interests, capitalist interests. Um, eh, Often we hear, often the focus on particularly fossil fuels. Let me talk for a moment about fossil fuels particularly is viewed through a kind of technics frame, like how do we swap out fossil fuels for renewable energies? What's the kind of technical framework for fossil fuels, and how can that be transformed? Which is an important discussion to have, but doesn't get to the heart of, I think, our planetary crisis as such. There's also, of course, a framework of kind of the global imbalance, the power imbalance, the corporate power imbalance, the colonialist power imbalance between those governments that are producing most of our crises and perpetuating these death machines, and those governments that are not in any way responsible for the planetary crisis, but whose people are suffering the consequences. There's also another framework of looking at capitalism and profiteering. Um, uh, One of the brilliance of this report, one of the brilliant features of this report, I believe, is bringing those things together, and also, and this is where my interests particularly align, bringing a gender, a feminist analysis to that feminist lens, um, and viewing this whole convergence of fossil fuels, nuclear power, militarism, repressive power through a cultural frame. And that's where I enter personally through my own research and my own interest. That's where I enter this discussion, is looking at it as a cultural problem, as well as a technical problem, as well as a global imbalance problem, as well as a problem of capitalism. The cultural frame of, like, in the ways in which production and consumption of militarism, fossil fuels, and nuclear power are highly gendered. And it's not as though that's the only framework to view this through. It's not as though understanding the gendered imbalance in these forces is going to solve everything, but it's a really important framework and lens through which to see this. And that's one of the things I think is great about this report, is that it kind of combines the many lenses through which to view this problematic, and brings a gendered analysis and a feminist analysis to it. Because I would argue that the common denominator, the common driver in this whole kind of network that we're trying to disassemble is, in fact, a hypermasculinity that that is what perpetuates attachment to fossil fuels. Because you have to stop and say, why, particularly at this moment in time when the terrible predations of our fossil fuel economies, terrible predations are becoming more evident. Why do we have this it's really obstinate attachment to fossil fuels? And I think that can't be explained without looking at it from a cultural and gendered point of view. The attachment to fossil fuels is an attachment to, on the one hand, a nostalgia for an industrial order when men were, unquestionably in charge of the industrial power of most strong economies. It's an attachment not only to the nostalgia, to an assertive masculinity that we will remain attached to fossil fuel production and consumption. And in fact, if you look at some of the statements of some of the leaders in key fossil fuel countries, you see this attachment, this kind of weird cultural masculinized attachment. I mean, when Trump and before him, what's her name, Sarah Palin, said, drill, baby, drill, that kind of assertiveness. We are going to drill. Well, what does that mean to drill? That kind of violence, that kind of hyper industrial techniques of actually producing fossil fuels. is very clearly identified with a masculine order and a masculine space. If you look at the fossil fuel industry, from the oil patch to the corporate boardrooms, it's in almost entirely, almost exclusively masculinized. In fact, I would argue that the fossil fuel industry is the most masculinized industry in the world, second perhaps only to militarism. We can talk about why I would put them in that sequence, but it's a highly masculinized endeavor, and the benefits, the economic benefits, the astonishingly almost unbelievable profits from fossil fuel industries are flowing almost exclusively to male elites. And now it looks as though male elites are trying to, and particularly the tech pros, are trying to get in on the nuclear power pipeline, although not literally a pipeline. Fossil fuels come out of and construct and kind of hold in place a masculine privilege. And if you look at the other side of the coin, or the same side of the coin, climate change denialism is also kind of framed in many ways in this tough guy commitment to, we will continue doing what we're doing and you can't tell us otherwise. You look at the rhetoric around climate change denial, you look at the rhetoric around commitment to fossil fuels, you look at the nature of the fossil fuel industry, and one of the most kind of apparent features of it is its masculinized nature. People often get nervous, when feminists talk about that. It's like, don't get nervous. Let's put on our kind of our analytical, let's use our best analytical lenses. And the hyper-masculinity of these industries, fossil fuel and nuclear power and militarism, cannot be ignored. We ignore them at our peril. And I actually wonder today, as we're thinking about and witnessing from an American point of view, the terrible destruction in the American South, particularly Florida, and the Appalachian region, we're witnessing the terrible destruction that has been wrought essentially by our commitment to fossil fuels. I wonder if that narrative in the US is going to change. But you look worldwide, and we're seeing these dramatic climate events, whether it's in Africa, both North and South Africa. I was just reading about Mozambique and some of the terrible both droughts and floods there, in Asia, in Central Europe, the terrible devastation being wrought by climate change. And no matter what anyone tries to tell you, it's climate change all the way down, all the way up and down. And I wonder if this convergence in this year, 2024, and particularly in some of the heartlands of the global economy in the US and in Europe, I wonder if that's going to change the narrative. And I actually would be interested in hearing other people's views on that, whether we're going to have a changed narrative. But right now, the narrative is all about, is still about a commitment to fossil fuels. And that commitment to fossil fuels is often kind of masked by a commitment to some presumed kind of economic logic. It's like, oh, well, we can't end fossil fuels because blah, blah, because it's so difficult, because it's so technologically challenging, because we're so committed. Yes, to all of those things. Of course, you can't just flip a switch, an apt metaphor. You can't just flip a switch and be off fossil fuels tomorrow. But we can be off fossil fuels the day after tomorrow, metaphorically speaking. So it's a challenge. It's difficult. But why are we still committed to fossil fuels? And a colleague of mine said came up with an expression that I like to use, Jody Emmel. She said, we must not make it easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of fossil fuel toxic masculinity. And I love that expression from Jody Emmel, who's written about this in several important articles. That why is it easier to imagine, in some ways, the end of the world through our commitment to fossil fuels? And I think one of the reasons why it's easier to imagine, or to be complacent, for many of the elites to be complacent about imagining the end of the world, is because the elites, and again, a highly masculinized cohort, believe that they can protect themselves. So we've all read about, particularly in the tech industry, these hyper wealthy men building themselves, kind of bunkers or retreats in New Zealand. Somehow New Zealand has become identified as the safe place in the world, which it's not at all. But anyway, that's, but why has it become easier to imagine really the end of the world, or the end of habitable and safe world? And I think it's because the small cohort of elites feel that they will escape the damage. And as I say, I think right now, watching some of the climate change effects in effect coming home might change that narrative. It's like, stay tuned. Let's look at the next 6 months. Let's think about let's see what these elites are saying about fossil fuels. Well, we know one of the things they're saying is, oh, we'll swap over to nuclear power, which is just one of the most insane ideas I've ever encountered. It's like, oh yeah, that's a really great idea. Why don't we go from rampant destruction of the planet to total poisoning of the planet? Hey, that sounds like a good swap. Me being cynical, of course. So anyway, I'm starting to ramble a bit, so I'll constrain myself by saying that I don't think we can understand the commitment to fossil fuels. I don't think we can understand the consequences of fossil fuels. I don't think we can understand the reluctance to move off a fossil fuel economy. I don't think we can understand the so-called attraction of the nuclear power, switching to nuclear power. I don't think we can understand any of those things and work against them if we don't use our best feminist analysis and inquire into the role of a hypermasculinity in perpetuating all of those forces. And of course, militarism. Have I talked about militarism enough? As a hyper masculinized force. Okay, I think I'll stop talking now. I don't know how long you wanted me to talk, but I think this would be a good point for me to pause. And I don't know if Edwick has managed to join us. If so, hopefully we'll have Edwick able to speak. And if not, I turned over to Ray for where we're going now.
Yes, we're going on the fly here. Edwick is still not connected.
Oh, that's too
And
bad.
it doesn't look like she will be connected from
Wow.
what I'm hearing. So thank you so much, though, Joni, for those remarks. Extremely important analysis of so many elements. I think, when you were speaking, I was thinking about the connections, of course, and the similarities that were brought up through our conversations with many people for this report of the relationship between masculine privilege and power, and the masculinized sense of what fossil fuels are and how the language that's used around that. And I remember when I was listening to you speak about that in the interview portion, I was thinking about Carol Cohn's early work that's very similar around nuclear weapons and the way that these nuclear war planners, who were all men back in the 1980s, and the way they would talk about missiles and bombs, and would have their visitors go pat a bomb and everything else. It's like,
Right.
these are objectified in a very masculinized way. And I think understanding how then that seeps into the approach and sort of the untouchability of these industries, that we just have to live with them and that they're part of our culture, is really noteworthy. I think also another similarity that really came out to me in this process was the ways in which these industries discount harm to so many people, and especially indigenous communities whose land the pipelines go through, and where the uranium is mined, and where the nuclear waste is buried. And so the disproportionate harm to indigenous folks is very similar. The harm also in terms of like the fossil fuel man camps that get set up, and the gendered and sexual violence that happens around those camps is very similar to what we heard talking to folks that live near uranium mines or nuclear weapon labs that have impacts on the local economies in really specific ways. Also, of course, the experiences of police shutting down, or trying to shut down land defense movements, the tactics that they use to undermine movements and to infiltrate is similar to the experiences that some folks had when they were protesting waste dumps or uranium mines in Australia and the US and elsewhere. So yeah, there's endless connections that we explore in this report. And I think these are really important to understanding how we can work in solidarity with each other, because there are so many similarities structurally and financially and philosophically amongst these industries. Edwick, if she had joined when she was in the interviews with us, she was really speaking as well about the environmental impacts in Zimbabwe of China's involvement in quote unquote development in the African continent, and how that has played out locally in villages in Zimbabwe, but also then in terms of financing and the ways in which the state would repress dissent against those protesting these development projects. And so that was another interesting angle we really wanted to highlight in this webinar. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like that will be possible today, but I'm going to pass it over to Genevieve, who will talk about the recommendations in the report and where we're going to go from here. So over to you, Genevieve.
Thank you so much, Ray, and thank you, Joni. And I completely agree with what Ray just said. I would really encourage you, if Edwick is unable to join ultimately, WILPF Zimbabwe does fantastic work, and some of it is available, of course, in the report. Edwick's contributions are visible in the report in terms of case studies on Zimbabwe, but also on the WILPF website, there's a lot of information about the work of WILPF Zimbabwe, including on disarmament, on the environment, on the women, peace, and security agenda. They've done a lot of really fantastic work on specifically highlighting, including, among others, the artisanal mining sector, as Ray was just mentioning. So if she's unable to join herself, then I hope that you'll all take the opportunity to read a little bit more about WILPF Zimbabwe's work on the WILPF website. My name is Genevieve Riccoboni, and as Ray said, I'm the program coordinator for WILPF's Women, Peace, and Security program based in New York. And my job is now to sort of talk a little bit about some of the conclusions we made and some of the recommendations. I want to mention here, since we might have a little more time, that there's a very wide range of case studies that are explored in the report, and each of the chapters really dives deep into some of these. So we have discrete chapters on the nuclear industry, on the fossil fuel industry, and also on policing and private military and security companies. And in each of these chapters, it's really a deep dive into the themes, and then exploring also cross-cutting themes, which are detailed in more specificity in an industry connections chapter as well. And I think throughout the report, as Ray was mentioning, there's really so many. We've really tried to unpack the ways that these industries operate and are connected. And there are a number of cross-cutting themes that we explored throughout the report, including, the ways that these industries are causes and drivers of conflict and violence, impacts on health and well-being, many of which are gendered impacts, impacts to reproductive health, impacts in terms of disease, impacts in terms of gender-based violence surrounding like the man camps that just came up, impacts on the environment, which also in context of environmental crisis and disaster, we know that also that affects people differently based on their gender, based on their race, their positionalities, and also really as Joni demonstrated so clearly, some of the leadership, the decision making, who holds the power, those are also highly gendered dynamics, as is the repression of resistance. And so I think throughout the report, there's really a lot of rich detail on all of these themes that it was really a pleasure to explore throughout the research process. And I think it was also a very generative process of being able to speak to people who are working on these issues in their own communities and seeing how they're also connecting the dots. Many of the interviewees were talking themselves about both themes because they're deeply relevant to their lives, to many of which have intergenerational impacts on communities as well. So I will, I think, take a moment to screen share the recommendations. We have a wide number of recommendations. I will probably not read all of them, but they really are clustered in a few different categories, which are really abolition, accountability, and repair. And we think that it's really critical to deepen the networks across all regions and geographies, to share knowledge with each other and to learn from more heterodox approaches, including feminist, indigenous, and decolonial views. And so let me just take a moment to share my screen. I have sorry, bear with me for a moment. Okay, I hope my screen is visible.
Yes.
Perfect. So first, we have a number of cross-cutting recommendations, which really touch on a lot of different themes that were covered in the report. So number one is around, and yeah, they're in no particular order, but I'll just, I'll go in the order that they're presented in the report. And all of these are verbatim in the final section of the report, so no need to worry about them now. You can take a look at the report and see all of them and explore them in further detail. But we recommend that the reduction of the use of energy, the reduce of energy and promoting degrowth policies is really essential. It's critical to disrupt the actors that are involved in these industries, including the networks, and exposing the networks that are actually propping them up through financing, through lobbying, which we know that both of these industries have incredibly powerful lobbyists. The fossil fuel lobbyists are everywhere, including infiltrating multilateral climate negotiations and seriously impacting the ability of those to deliver on what they have to do in order to have a future that is livable for all species on our planet. We also recommend pushing back against pinkwashing, rainbow washing, and greenwashing the activities of these industries, and really exposing them for the harms that they are causing. And instead, we recommend nurturing movements that are connected, but also intergenerational, where we're learning from each other, where we're able to both like bring in young people, future generations, but also learn from those who have been active in these movements for so many years, survivors of nuclear and also of different climate disasters that we know are already happening and are already impacting our world. We recommend to donors that it's critical to provide funding, and I think this one is a really important recommendation. This funding needs to be long-term, it needs to be sustained, it needs to be flexible, and it should be core funding as well. Movements are really struggling to secure funding, especially grassroots movements in the Global South, indigenous movements. And it's really essential that our movements are funded so that we're able to do this work and work together in a way that can be sustained and can be impactful. And to that point, it's also critical that these movements are centering the participation, perspectives, and recommendations of Indigenous peoples, and really at its core, the demand for land back. We also recommend extending international solidarity, shifting our economies to be more based on provision of social well-being rather than the accumulation of wealth by a few. We recommend challenging the systems of oppression that are sustaining and reinforcing these industries, and also ultimately conflict prevention. We recommend advocating for cooperation, disarmament, and trust building. We need to see so much more of that. And we need to also make sure that in the just transition, in the transition to renewable energy, that it actually is not also reinforcing some of the same patterns of conflict and violence. We do not want to see conflict over critical minerals. And that's a real risk that is also explored in this report, and that also folks in WILPF are working on. So we need to also make sure that we're not perpetuating harm when trying to solve one problem. We recommend, of course, holding industry accountable, and also ensuring that international financial institutions are are supporting more are not, promoting privatization, austerity, and instead are promoting economic and social policies centered on human rights, care, and equality. So now we have a number of recommendations on the nuclear industry, with at its core the demand for abolishing nuclear weapons and dismantling the entire nuclear industry. So some of these recommendations, among many, and there's a great deal of information in the report, both about the harms of the entire nuclear chain, but also about recommendations for how to address all of those. So we call for stopping nuclear weapon research, development, testing, production, and modernization, ending financing for nuclear, dismantling nuclear weapons programs, and achieving the universalization and implementation of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons to ban nuclear weapons. So we also talk about the AUKUS military arrangement, nuclear-powered submarines, decommissioning nuclear power stations, ending uranium mining, preventing nuclear waste dumps, and also implementing standards for the governance of programs around nuclear waste storage and disposal. We also call for investigating on a deeper level the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons, including the gendered and racialized harms of nuclear weapons. This is something that I know Reaching Critical Will works on and has been leading on for a long time within the movement. And we also, again, this speaks to also the demands for accountability and repair. It's essential to provide reparations for nuclear harms and to work for nuclear justice. And there are a number of recommendations here, which are drawn from the Asia-Pacific Leadership Network's infographic on nuclear justice, which includes things such as access to healthcare, investments in remediation of affected land and water and communities, acknowledgement and apology, transparency around historical documents, scholarships, participation of affected communities, and reparations, among others. And now we have recommendations on the fossil fuel industry as well. And I think the first one is really covers it, which is implement a fair, fast, full, and funded fossil fuel phase out. I love the alliteration, and I think it really captures the demand really critically. And to what I was saying earlier around multilateral climate negotiations and to some of the state capture that we explore throughout the report that is present among both of these industries, the presence of fossil fuel representatives in multilateral climate negotiations is a severe risk, especially when also we need to instead be having the participation of those who are at the front lines of the climate and planetary crisis, including people from small island states, conflict-affected communities, those who are really already being impacted so deeply by this. So we also call for challenging false solutions, working for a just transition, including by avoiding the green extractivism, which these are some terms that are also explored in greater detail throughout the report. Free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples. And also speaking to the point around capitalism and around public ownership and around the incentive, the corrupt incentives that are present with the profit motive. We also call for reclaiming the energy sector through more democratic governance and public ownership and transforming it so that it's not run for profit. Now we have recommendations, and again, all of these are in the report, so sorry for kind of breezing through them. I hope it's not too quick. We have recommendations on policing and private military and security companies, including around defunding policing and redirecting funds towards education, housing, food security, healthcare, environmental protection, banning use of surveillance technologies, divesting from weapons producers, not building cop cities and further training facilities for police. This is a trend that we're seeing in some countries, including in the United States, but we know that also security forces do a lot of exchange and training and share harmful practices across borders. So this is something that it's important to disrupt. We also call, in the meantime, for ensuring greater transparency and access to information and monitoring the activities of private military sectors, and mercenaries, there are a number of recommendations that were made by the Working Group on Mercenaries. And these are very strong and also include recommendations on targeting of human rights and environmental defenders, which are really essential. So one of which was also recommended by the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights around states needing to adopt comprehensive public policies of prevention and protection for human rights defenders and environmental defenders, with the active participation of human rights defenders. One thing that is touched on throughout the report is the repression, and often gendered repression, of environmental activists, of human rights defenders, of any of the people who are resisting the activities of these industries, as well as others, such as peace builders. So peace builders, feminists. So this is a really important recommendation that is cross-cutting and that we need to be able to have protection for our movements. And that is it, as if there are not enough recommendations. So I think that's all for me, and I'll pass it back to Ray. Thank you so much again for attending this webinar.
Thanks very much, Genevieve. Great overview of comprehensive recommendations that are in the report. We really encourage you to go through them. They are not exhaustive by any means, but they are drawn from what came up in our conversations and in the work of those of us working on this project and on other issues. So we've had a few questions, and if you do have any questions, please use the Q&A function, and we will respond to those.
Ray, can I just jump in for a second?
Absolutely.
Okay, I just want to say that as Genevieve was talking and going through the report, I want to draw our attention, of all the wonderful things to draw our attention to and horrible things, I want to draw attention to the current rush to false solutions, because as the effects of climate change, fossil fuel use, that might be one thing that we actually could change in our language, stop talking about climate change or climate chaos and start specifically talking about fossil fuel use producing these disasters. Anyway, as we think, as the effects are becoming better covered in mass media, not only in the US, but as far as I'm aware, pretty much around the world, as the effects of fossil fuel use are the terrible effects and the very differentiated effects of fossil fuel use are becoming apparent. There's more and more anxiety about coming up with solutions that, that's air quote solutions, that do not involve getting off the fossil fuel train. So they are things such as these solutions that some elite private corporations and in some cases governments are getting into, about putting iron filings into oceans or putting huge sunshade umbrellas, in effect umbrellas, in space, in kind of upper atmosphere, putting certain chemicals into the upper atmosphere that will block incoming sun. There are all of these solutions that are now coming up that 10 years ago were being talked about and were being talked about then as completely crazy, and are now being talked about as though somehow these are normal and acceptable ideas, if not solutions, ideas. And the normalization of crazy manipulation of our geosystems is something I think we need to be really cautious about. And who are putting forward these solutions? Similarly, the false solution of reviving and, in fact, enhancing nuclear power. But there's this kind of false trade-off. It's this desperate moment of doing everything we possibly can except ending fossil fuels. It's like, oh, let's change the ocean chemistry. Oh, let's change the atmospheric chemistry. Oh, let's go back to nuclear power. It strikes me as a form of kind of collective insanity, but I just want to put that out there as something that this false solutions industry, really it's an industrial complex, is picking up speed. That's all I'll say at this point.
Absolutely. No, that's a great contribution, and it's absolutely something that we're fighting against in the nuclear industry as well. And, you know, yeah, nuclear power being the solution. And actually, one of the things that came up in this report was the ways in which the fossil fuel industry is actually using this so-called resurgence of nuclear power in order to extend its life. Because, of course, one of the problems with nuclear power is that it takes decades. It will take decades to bring any of these reactors online. And so in the meantime, who's going to produce energy? It's going to be the fossil fuel industry. So they're working hand in hand on these schemes to continue profiting and literally burning the world. So these are the types of conversations that we want to keep happening with this project. Next steps for this project that we're envisioning include convening people together to look at the recommendations, to look at the content of the report, to see what's useful for people that are working in movements, and to continue this building of connections between folks working for the abolition of police, fossil fuels, and nuclear weapons and nuclear energy, and other extractive industries. And so we hope to continue that over the next years. Also, because the report relied on contributions from folks around the world, we really do want to invest in translation of the report. It's a very large report, so that will require some investment, but we're hoping to make it accessible to more people to also reflect the contributions that we received in the production of the report. So I'm going to turn now to the Q&A for a few questions. So there was a couple questions that were just asking about the webinar recording. Yes, it will be recorded and shared after the event. So you will receive the link to that, and it will be on WILPF's YouTube channel. And then in terms of some of the questions, I think the first two questions are related to each other. And so I don't know, Genevieve, Joni, if either of you want to weigh in. But the first one from Gretchen is about how would an individual get started advocating for change? And Balkrishna is asking about public education and awareness raising and suggestions for ways and means for educating folks. So we'll start with those two, and then we'll move to others. I don't know if either of you want to jump in.
Oh, I'll jump in. Why not? In terms of how we can start kind of, essentially, I would put both of those questions together about kind of raising public awareness. I think it's really important that we have multi-pronged efforts. So there has to be formal education, of course. There has to be better media coverage. There has to be, and we can advocate for better media coverage, those of us in our own local medias. There have to be these kinds of analyses, such as this wonderful report. But I also think there's a lot of power in kind of casual, everyday encounters. And so, and again, I'll speak briefly to the American context right now, looking at these terrible disasters that are happening in the South and Mid-Atlantic states. And I had a conversation with someone just like literally in the store the other day, and they said something about, because I was looking at the newspaper that was on the stand, and they said, "Oh my God, what's going on in the Appalachian region is just terrible." And I said, "Yes," and I actually said, "Yes, it is," and to think that it's all because we are so committed to fossil fuels. And the person looked at me as though I was odd, because it was a bit of an odd conversation to have just with a stranger. But I thought to myself afterwards, I didn't do it so intentionally at the moment, but I thought afterwards how important, I mean, maybe she just thought I was an odd person. Maybe she didn't even understand what I was really saying, blah, blah, blah. But I thought about the power of just everyday interactions that we have with neighbors and people in the community and so forth. Or, it's a little old fashioned now, but, kind of letters to the editor, letters to, say, media, to just, I think it's important for each of us in all of our interactions to try to intervene at appropriate moments and say, yes, isn't it terrible that the fossil fuel industry has brought us to this point? Or isn't it terrible that we're witnessing the outcome of our commitment to this crazy energy complex? Now, I think that we can, become identified as like the crazy woman down the street who's always talking about fossil fuels. So you want to avoid being like overdoing this, but I think everyday encounters are very important. And so I would urge all of us to take opportunity of making those everyday encounters. Highlight some of the things that we feel are really important, like the militarism, fossil fuel, nuclear complex, in ways that work in everyday conversation. But I also think, of course, there's no substitute for actual structured and formal analysis and education. And I think that we can, again, using the US example, I apologize for that, but in the US, there's terrible right wing pushback against public education and constraints on what teachers in public schools can and can't teach. And one of the things that's under attack is teaching about climate change. And so those of us who are in communities where discussion of climate change is being prohibited or constrained in formal school level learning, I think we need to speak up about that. I mean, I think there's all kinds of opportunities for in our everyday environment for pushing back and making visible the problem.
Thanks so much, Shoni. Great answers. Genevieve, did you have anything to add, or should I?
I don't think so. I think that pretty much covered it for me.
Okay.
So
so there's a question from Anne about defunding the police. I thought I would kick off with that, but of course, Joni and Genevieve, if you have things to add. So yes, the police abolition movement is quite well established, particularly in the United States, but in other countries as well. And defunding police is part of these efforts. And as with any abolitionist project, it's never just about removing something, right? It's always about what we build instead. So we divest and we invest. We take the money that is given to a system of violence and harm, and we invest it instead in things that actually provide for the needs of people. And so in the case of police, the conversations there are usually around what are the things that people need in order to be able to thrive in our communities and our societies. So we're looking at jobs, we're looking at secure housing, food security, education, recreational opportunities, safe spaces. And so the police are not providing any of that. I think, Joni's been talking a bit about what's been going on in Appalachia. I think the police guarding the grocery stores to prevent people from being able to access basic food and water during a time of crisis tells you everything you need to know about what police are there to protect, right? It's not people, it's corporate interests, it's private profits. And I think we really do need to challenge ourselves about what the police are, because the police, there's so many television shows about the police, right? And police abolitionists have a phrase for this, propaganda. And police don't do what police do in the television shows. They're actually a really grave source of harm, especially for Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, LGBTQ communities, other marginalized folks in society. And their massive budgets, massive budgets, don't protect, they actually harm. And I think another great recent example of this was in New York City just a couple of weeks ago. The NYPD opened fire on somebody who had evaded the $2.90 fare for the subway. So how about, instead of giving the NYPD billions of dollars a year, which is taking money from every other social service in the city, and instead of giving police money to shoot people on the subway for evading the fare, why don't we make public transit free? It would be a lot cheaper than funding the NYPD to shoot people. So I think these are the types of questions and interrogations we need to make. And then we can, through that process, determine where money would be better spent and what will actually bring harm or well-being to communities instead of harms. So I don't know if Joni or Genevieve, if you want to add anything there, or if we should move on to the next.
Yeah, just one thing to say. I mean, I think you covered it, right? But I think for me, it's the current reality we are living in is one where things like policing and militaries are receiving more and more funding. There's a lot of increased investment in militarization, in that sort of idea of solving problems. And I think when we ask ourselves in the context of, a planetary ecological emergency, in the context of a lot of other crises. Well, what are the things that actually need the investment? And when we see our leaders only really talking about problems that they propose police as a solution, that raises questions for me. And I think that it's a good thing to sort of ask questions about yeah, what sort of societies do we want to build? Where do we want to invest? And where is investment needed? And in contrast, I think, as Ray was saying, what are the actual impacts of these investments that are currently going and are dramatically increasing in some contexts in things like policing and militaries. So I think that was a good. I valued that portion of the report in part because WILPF, of course, has worked for many years on peace, on disarmament, from an anti-militarist feminist analysis. And I think applying that to contexts that are often more national in focus and looking at like other sort of security, quote unquote, security structures at different levels was valuable for me in terms of contrasting the level of the crisis that is being faced, and then the solution, which has often been to sort of repress the people who are naming the problem for what it is. So that's the only thing I wanted to add.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we've got some more great questions here. Joni, I think this one's for you from Roslyn. How far do you see supporting an international law against ecocide to be included as the fifth crime against peace in the Rome Statute? I don't know if you've been following those developments or want to comment on that.
Very lightly, it's not. I'm following it lightly. There certainly are really interesting legal developments around defining ecocide as a crime, and I'm not sure that it's actually the most effective tool. I mean, I'm certainly very interested in that movement to define ecocide as a crime, to attempt to prohibit it and identify it and prohibit it and place it where it should be as a crime. I'm not sure it's actually very effective yet. I've seen some local efforts on ecocide, and there's also kind of parallel efforts on giving resource systems rights. So, rivers now, in many places, rivers have been given rights as though more or less equivalent to human rights in the human rights framework, to give rivers, to give forests rights. I'm not sure that those have been very effective yet. That doesn't mean we shouldn't continue to try to develop those tools and use them. I think that they're just so in our current legal system. It's such a stretch beyond what our legal system is designed for and by and to do, that I'm not sure that I've seen effective consequences from giving rivers rights or defining ecocide as a crime. So I'm certainly in favor of it. I think it's a great new innovative approach that we should certainly explore. I wouldn't put right now a lot of confidence in the actual effectiveness of that, but maybe we won't see the effectiveness of that until we push it further. So I'm totally open to people who are. I think it's wonderful that people are. I think it's really great, and it could be consequential that people are trying that approach. But so far, I think the results are a little weak. But that's not a fully informed view of it.
Thanks, Joni. Appreciate that. Next question from Susan, in reference to your comment about 3 Mile Island and Microsoft purchasing nuclear power. And so this is, about powering artificial intelligence. And I think many of us have probably seen the recent articles about how much energy artificial intelligence and these massive data centers are using. And so Susan's just wondering if we have any comments on this about the projected need for power for AI. So I don't know, Joni, if you want to start or.
I'll just say that I too have been kind of taken by surprise, or I'm kind of running to catch up with the awareness of how much power AI takes and the generation of AI. And I haven't followed it as closely as perhaps I should. I was also, though, noting that the company that has moved AI forward most assertively, OpenAI, has just announced that it's shifting basically from a nonprofit for the public good to a profit-making company. And I think that that's not inconsequential when we think about how then they want to try and power this by using systems that are, to use the previous person's question, that are ecocidal, to using technologies that are ecocidal to power it. So I think that there's now a, AI has, I think, taken most of us by surprise. I mean, it was only, I don't know, a year and a half ago that I teach at a university, and it was only a year and a half ago that universities were saying, "Oh my God, AI is like it's going to take over. Students won't be doing any reading; they won't be doing any work of their own. It's all AI." I mean, it's just even in the last couple of years that most of us, obviously specialists, have been more aware of it, but most of us who are part of the kind of lay public have become aware of how all-encompassing these AI systems can become, and the energy use of AI systems, and the now enormous profit centers that AI companies are beginning to represent. And so I think as they become more profit centers, in particular the shift of OpenAI from a nonprofit to a profit company, I think we're just going to see this escalate. And I am confident of only one thing, and that is that shift to AI profit making will have extraordinarily negative environmental effects. Anyway, yeah, okay, I'll stop there.
Yeah, thanks, Joni. I was also thinking too that this is another great example of the cross connections between fossil fuels in terms of energy use, but then also militarism in the military industries. Because as someone who works in disarmament, I've been following AI mostly through its use by militaries and also by police, and so looking at again the ways that artificial intelligence algorithms are being used in like predictive policing software and racial profiling and voice identification and surveillance. Also looking at the ways that certain militaries have started incorporating this technology into their weapon systems. So there's been some reports about Israel's use of this in the genocide in terms of Lavender and Find Daddy and these other applications of AI and algorithms. And then, of course, WILPF was part of the Stop Killer Robots campaign, which is focusing on the development of autonomous weapon systems. And we've been trying to prevent this for 10 years. And like you say, it's only been very recently that the reality has caught up to our fears of what is possible with this technology. And we're now facing a landscape in which governments like Russia and the United States successfully have blocked the development of international law that could have preemptively prohibited some of this technology. And so the risks of a new arms race alongside of the perpetual nuclear arms race and conventional military arms racing is now upon us. So there's a lot to be paying attention to in terms of AI and opposing in that field. Yeah, okay, so we have a question here about the understanding of decommissioning costs of nuclear power. Adriana is asking, does the public or media understand that when costs of building nuclear power are discussed, they don't include what it will cost to close and clean up these facilities, and including social, health, environmental costs and risks of investments? So I don't know if that's something you want to take, Joni, or want me to address, or...
I'll just say that in general, I think that we collectively know there's very little media attention, there's very little public policy attention to the entire chain of nuclear power. When we think of fossil fuels, most people now understand there's a chain from the oil field to the actual, coming out of the pipeline into your home or into industry. There's a whole chain of production and consumption. I would hazard an observation that we are collectively paying less attention to the chain of nuclear power production. So you've mentioned it a few times, and really critical things about the production chain of starting with uranium and mining and indigenous lands, but going all the way through to post the end life of nuclear power plants. Most of the media attention is focused, most of the public policy attention is focused on the actual nuclear plants. It's my kind of generalized impression, and the before and after of the nuclear power production is much less understood and much less paid attention to. All I'll say there.
Yes, I agree with that, Joni. And there's a lot of work for us to be doing in terms of the public awareness raising that you addressed earlier in this context. And I think this also relates to the question that Janice asks after about even a lot of environmentalists are supporting nuclear power as a better choice than fossil fuels. And so now, of course, there's other things in terms of renewable energy sources. And of course, we also here have to be attuned to the extractive processes that go along with some of these renewable energies. But also we need to not be greenwashing nuclear energy. So I think these two questions are related. One great resource that's just come out in the last couple of months that I would really recommend is a book called Nuclear is Not the Solution by M.B. Ramana, who's based out at the University of British Columbia and is a nuclear scientist who has spent most of his career critiquing nuclear power in India and Canada and in other places. And it goes through all of these different arguments for that both environmentalists and pro-nuclear power people make about why nuclear is not actually the solution to the climate crisis or the solution to phasing out fossil fuels. So yeah, just wanted to direct people's attention there and encourage everybody, of course, to be countering these terrible arguments. And I think there's a lot of great examples of costs around the world from all stages of the so-called nuclear fuel chain, right, from uranium mining through to waste. The report that we've produced highlights many of these. So I think you'll find in the footnotes lots of great resources and materials and examples there. One I wanted to highlight is Joshua Frank's Atomic Days is another book. And it's about the Hanford nuclear site, Hanford in Washington State, which is a plutonium reprocessing facility. And it is known as the most toxic place in America. And it has spills and leakages and all kinds of accidents over its many years of operation. It's now closed, but is still causing grave environmental harm. So I think the more specific examples in the local context we can raise, the more that will impact people's thinking about this. I see there's in the chat also Ellen and Cheryl have both addressed a specific campaign called Warheads to Windmills, which is about conversion and climate connections. And so Ellen was asking about WILPF's input there, and Cheryl has indicated that some WILPF members have indeed been participating in that coalition. But I don't know if either Genevieve or Joni, if you have any experience with that particular group or any comments to make on that.
I don't know.
Okay. Great. Okay, yeah, and I see another question from Cheryl. I will put the title of the book in the chat. Just give me 1 second. Okay, so we have a question from Olenka about Latin America and the impact of organized crime being linked with illegal mining and oil industries and the destruction of the Amazon ecosystem and indigenous land in that context. And I don't know if either of you have comments about that specific situation. There isn't a specific question. It's more just raising, I think, awareness of this. And we did actually have some folks from Latin America who were interviewed for this project. Unfortunately, they weren't available to join for the webinar today, but some of their views are indeed reflected in the report.
Yeah, just go ahead, Genevieve.
No, it's okay, Joni, you go first.
Okay, what I was going to say was one of the things that has been highlighted in these linkages of organized crime, organized activities, oil extraction and exploration and extraction in places such as, and importantly in the Amazon, is the uselessness of the international legal system, because an oil company that may be, I don't know, based in the Netherlands, but through a subsidiary that's German, subcontracting to a company that's Mexican, operating in Ecuador, who holds them responsible for the pollution of oil extraction? The answer is no one. There's actually no legal path through that thicket. And we've seen that in many, many cases, including the case against Chevron in the Amazon, that it's almost impossible to hold international globalized oil companies who manage to position themselves several handshakes away from the actual environmental damage sites. It's almost impossible to hold them accountable. And that's an element in all of this. The impunity, I mean, we talk about impunity when we talk about militarism and policing. The impunity of oil companies is just staggering when they operate in places such as the Amazon or in many parts of Africa and Asia. So I'll just put that out.
Yeah, the only thing I wanted to highlight was that in terms of the Latin American context, as Ray said, we did have several of the experts who were interviewed for this research were from Mexico and Brazil. And so some of those contexts are explored a little more in terms of phenomena like drought, also the some of the dynamics in multilateral climate negotiations and oil extraction. Also indigenous rights in Latin America. So some of those are present in the report a little bit. And I believe the person who was interviewed, who's an activist from Mexico, highlighted some of the linkages between some of the major development sites that are being done in Mexico, some of the sort of mega projects, and the locations of those mega projects overlapping with some of the states in Mexico with the highest organized crime activity. So I hope that those contributions in the report will be of interest to you, and that you'll be able to see a little bit more of that and how that is being connected to some of the other case studies.
Great, thank you to both of you. I did put the names of books in the chat. I think I see another question about engagement in COP29 on this subject from Manju, asking if there's going to be any large advocacy initiatives being taken up there by feminists. So I'm going to turn the floor to Michelle, who is with WILPF's environment program and involved in the COP process, to answer that one.
Thank you so much, Ray, and thank you so much, Manju, for the question. Yes, feminists are definitely engaged in the process. There is a working group which is called Peace and Demilitarization within the Women and Gender constituency, and it's actually also a cross-working group which is organizing several gatherings. We're organizing also interventions, and we're coming together in preparation for the COP. So if you're interested in joining, please feel free to reach out to me, and I can definitely add you to the group. There's also panel discussions planned on the intersections, particularly of militarism and climate justice. So we are currently in the process of organizing some of these panels. What I can say is that this year the engagement is very much reduced. It has been really challenging to really apply for official side events on the topic, but we will make sure to really address also these intersections in the UNFCCC. And we are also actually in contact at the moment with Peace Boat to plan a side event, also with a view on particularly the Pacific. So I'm really sure that their aspects of demilitarization, climate justice, but also denuclearization will come up again. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Michelle. Really appreciate that. Yes. And there has been as well at the COP meetings and in other spaces like that, a strong anti-nuclear coalition. Don't nuke the climate is what the banner they organize under. And that's really important as well to not let the pro-nuclear so-called environmentalists take over. I don't know how you can call yourself an environmentalist and be pro-nuclear power, but some people try and square that circle. So that's all of the questions that we've had in the Q&A function. And so I just wanted to say thank you so much for that really lively engagement. Oh, there's another question that just popped in from Adriana. With water systems being crucial to nuclear development, could curtailment or transparency be defined by stewards of water bodies, including Indigenous First Nations, intergovernmental, interagency, etc.? So yeah, I guess the addressing or challenging the rise of nuclear power by water, those concerned with water conservation and protection. Yeah, I think that's a great connection. I don't know if that has been done in the past. I don't know, Joni, if you have any knowledge of that. But I think that given the uses of water that are necessary for cooling nuclear power, this is really essential. I think, one of the things that we've seen with Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine and occupation of and attacks against the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is that the coolant systems have been at risk. And so this is yet another problem with nuclear power, right? Of like what happens in times of armed conflict. And we're seeing this play out in real time now. And so if the cooling system is impacted, the massive amounts of water that are necessary to prevent meltdowns, then this can cause grave international radioactive harm. But yeah, I don't know, Joni, if you have anything to add there.
No, I would just echo what you said, Ray, in that it's a great connection. I actually hadn't thought of that about the water use and the possible entry point for regulation through kind of, as the questioner said, through kind of water regulation. I think that's great. Great connection.
Very good, which is exactly what we want coming out of these conversations, is more connections and more ways that we can work across all of these issues and bring more people into the movements to abolish fossil fuels, police, and the nuclear industry. So we're going to wrap up here. I think that if there's any final comments that Genevieve or Joni you would like to make, now is the time.
I would say read the report. Everyone who's in attendance, read the report. It's a great, it's first of all an accomplishment to actually produce this amazing piece of work. But more than that, the interconnectivity of ideas that's represented in this report is really impressive and very unusual. So I congratulate everyone who was involved in actually pulling this together. But it's a really important resource, and more than just a resource, because that sounds so instrumental. It actually, for me, has sparked new ideas. It kind of gives pathways for new analyses. So I think it's great.
Great. Thank you so much, Joni. Genevieve?
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you so much, everyone, for coming out and demonstrating interest in this topic. There's so much rich insight and knowledge that's present in the report. And I'm also grateful to Joni for sharing your wisdom with us. And I learned so much from this report, and I think I completely agree that it's the kind of thing that it's constantly sparking new ideas. I know that when I was contributing myself to the report, there were so many things that I highlighted, I want to come back to, I want to research further, I want to learn more about. And I think that's really the beauty of both the solidarity that is and the interconnectedness that is present and really demonstrated throughout this research. So I'm really grateful to my colleagues for letting me participate in this process and to learn from all of you. So thank you, and thanks to everyone for coming today.
Amazing. Great. Thank you to both of you. I just wanted to say that if anybody is interested in following up on the report, you can always reach out to us. And as we mentioned earlier, we'll be trying to continue these conversations and invest in some translations in the period ahead. So please stay tuned for what's next. And thank you very much for joining us today.